Um, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about inequality, which seems to be on the minds of a lot of people these days, and then talk about what types of policies help reduce it. Not only the inequality between individuals, but also between entire ethnic and racial groups. And I'm going to draw primarily from the work of two scholars. The first is Thomas Sowell, who's an economist at Stanford University and has written widely on economic progress of different groups, both here in the U.S. as well as internationally, most recently in his book Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. And the second scholar is Jared Diamond, who's a professor of geography at the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA. And he's written about geographic determinism and how it shaped human societies in books like Guns, Germs, and Steel is his most popular work. But I wanted to start by taking issue with how the inequality debate is often framed. The presumption is that equal outcomes, or at least something approaching equal outcomes, is the norm, and that where we don't find it, something is necessarily wrong. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't be bothered by inequality. We should be, and most of us are. But the goal here is to understand why it persists, despite the fact that nobody finds it desirable. And the reason inequality exists is because it's the norm. It's not the exception. Disparities, gaps, inequities are not always strange or sinister. They are natural and rampant in all kinds of human endeavors around the world. Yes, discrimination and exploitation exist, and they can worsen these inequities, but they hardly explain disparate outcomes, which exist even among groups of the same race and ethnicity. I think too often in these discussions we assume that random outcomes are natural. But how could that be given that the inputs are so grossly unequal? Groups don't advance at the same rate, not within countries, not between countries, not historically, and not currently. Nor is there any guarantee that a group that has advanced will necessarily stay advanced. In a previous era, China was the most advanced society on the planet. Later, it would be the Middle East, then Europe, and then America. Ancient Greek society was far superior to ancient Britain, mainly due to Greece being located near the Middle East, where agriculture developed and spread to nearby southern Europe. Without agriculture, it's difficult, if not impossible, to have cities, which are the source of most advancements in civilization. As I mentioned, Jared Diamond and Thomas Sowell have pointed out how consequential geographic differences alone have been in the economic advancement of a group. How geography alone can expand or restrict the development of what economists call human capital, by which they mean the skills and the knowledge and the cultural habits of a group. Again, this has been true not only here in the US, but also in Europe and Asia and Africa, where people from mountainous regions, for example, have consistently lagged behind people from the plains. But whatever the reasons behind these economic disparities, what's important to understand is that they've been so common throughout history. Today, Germany is 3 times richer than Serbia. Japan is 9 times richer than India. Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP is less than a tenth of Europe's. Now, some have suggested that this world inequality exists because some countries were able to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution, while others could not. But one problem with this explanation is that the inequalities among nations did not begin with the Industrial Revolution, or with colonialism for that matter, or with slavery. Some say Africa is poor because the West plundered it, but Africa was poor before the colonists arrived. It was poor while they were there, and it was poor after they left. In America, there have been calls for slavery reparations for blacks. Proponents of this say that slave labor made America rich. Well, it's true that some individual slave owners prospered off of slavery, but that's different from saying the entire country was made better off economically. Slavery in America was concentrated in the South, Yet the South was the poorest region of the country, both during slavery and afterwards. The same can be said of Brazil. Those regions of Brazil that had slavery were poorer, both during slavery and afterwards, than those regions of Brazil that had few, if any, slaves. And despite importing far more slaves than America, Brazil never became as prosperous as America. There are more examples of this. Eastern Europe has long been poorer than Western Europe, even though Eastern Europe had slavery for a much longer period of time. This also holds true for Arab countries in North Africa and the Middle East, which imported far more African slaves than America did, and for a much longer period of time. If slave labor leads to prosperity, why did those Arab countries remain so poor for so long? And when they did finally become wealthier, it wasn't due to slavery. It was due to the discovery of oil beneath the sand. On an even more basic level, it's important to keep in mind that people don't behave randomly. They behave with a purpose in mind. They don't immigrate to other countries randomly, choose jobs or neighborhoods where to live randomly. They don't raise their children randomly. Behavior differs between groups, whether you break it down by race or ethnicity or sex or religion or even birth order. Each year in the U.S. we hold an academic competition for high school students. It's called the National Merit Scholarship Program. And there have been studies done of who performs well in this competition. One study found that among the finalists from families with 5 kids, the firstborn child was the finalist more often than the other 4 siblings combined. I mean, think about that. These are kids raised under the same roof by the same parents, yet the firstborn consistently comes out ahead. If you get such disparate outcomes within the same family, why are we surprised to see them between entire groups? The way children are raised also differs greatly from one income level to another. One study showed that children in families where the parents are professionals, doctors and lawyers and engineers, for example, their children hear about 2,100 words per hour at home on average. Children whose parents are working class, an auto mechanic or factory worker, their children hear about 1,200 words per hour. And children from poor families on welfare hear about 600 words on average. Now, that might not seem like a huge difference, but what it means is that over time, a 10-year-old child from a family on welfare will not have heard as many words at home as a 3-year-old child whose parents are professionals. You think about how that statistic alone can affect life outcomes for a child, how it can impact learning and job prospects later on. You can't blame racism or prejudice for this sort of thing, and nothing the government can do will give this welfare child the same life chances as the child of professional parents. Some people are very quick to blame racist educators for suspending black kids from school at higher rates than white kids, or they blame racist employers for higher black unemployment rates. The assumption is that if it weren't for discrimination, school suspension rates and unemployment rates would be more equal. But if the mix of children raised in welfare families is racially different from those raised in professional families, it makes perfect sense for us to see racial disparities in school discipline and in hiring. Let me use a personal example to illustrate this. Many years ago, shortly after I joined the Wall Street Journal, I took a trip home to Buffalo, New York, where I was born and raised, and I was visiting my older sister at the time, who had and chatting with her daughter, my niece, who was maybe in 2nd grade at the time. I was asking my niece about school and her favorite subjects and that sort of thing, when she stopped me and said, "Uncle Jason, why you talk white?" She then turned to her little friend who was there and said, "Don't my uncle sound white? Why are you trying to sound so smart?" Now, she was just teasing me, of course, and I smiled, and the 2 girls enjoyed a little laugh at my expense. But what she said stayed with me. I couldn't help thinking, here were 2 young black girls, 7 or 8 years old, already linking speech patterns to race and intelligence. They already had a somewhat sophisticated awareness that as blacks, white-sounding speech was not only to be avoided in their own speech, but mocked in the speech of others. Now, I shouldn't have been too surprised by this, and I wasn't. My siblings, along with countless other black friends and relatives, teased me the same way when I was growing up. And other prominent black professionals, from Barack Obama on down, have told similar stories. What I had forgotten is just how early these attitudes take hold, how soon this counterproductive thinking and behavior begins. In New York City, where I'm based, has the largest school system in America. And around 80% of black kids in New York City public schools are performing below grade level. 80%. And a big part of the problem is a black subculture that rejects attitudes and behaviors that are conducive to academic success. Black kids read half as many books and watch twice as much television as their white counterparts, for example. In other words, a big part of the problem is a culture that produces little black girls and boys who are already worried about acting and sounding white by the time they are in the second grade. New York City's most selective public high schools release demographic data each year on who's admitted, and there is nothing resembling a random distribution of students by race or ethnicity when it comes to who gets into these schools. There are 8 of them, and they admit students based on a single standardized exam. Every year, Asian students, who comprise just 16% of the city's public school system, are awarded more than 50% of the openings. By comparison, whites are about 15% of public school students in New York, and they get about 30% of the slots. Blacks are 26% of students and get about 5% of the seats. At Stuyvesant High School, which is the most selective public high school in the city, there are about 900 openings. In a typical year, fewer than 10 go to black students. The Asian student outcomes we see year after year aren't the result of luck or privilege. It stems from hard work and a culture that prioritizes learning. Research shows that Asian kids read more books, they watch less television, and they study longer than other groups. Even in poorer Asian families, money goes toward test prep instead of $300 sneakers. And the results are obvious at elite schools, not just in New York, but nationwide, where even low-income Asian students outperform middle and upper-income students from other groups. And we see this not only at our elite high schools, but also at our elite colleges. We're having a debate in America about eliminating standardized tests in order to promote more racial balance at these schools. Some claim that the tests themselves are racist. But if that's true, how is it that Asians, a racial minority group, gets the highest scores? The Asian experience also undermines efforts to use past discrimination as a blanket explanation for today's racial disparities. Black people, and I don't need to tell any of you this, aren't the only group to ever be discriminated against in the U.S. or around the world. Chinese Americans were lynched. Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps during World War II. Asians in California were forced to attend separate schools, kept out of certain jobs, not allowed to own land in some areas. Yet Asian Americans today outperform white Americans, both academically and economically, and have for decades. And the story is true among other racial and ethnic minority groups around the world. The ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in West Africa, and of course Jews all over the world are just a few examples. But there are many examples of racial and ethnic minority groups outperforming the majority, either economically or academically or both, despite being discriminated against in the past or even in the present. Now, none of this is to deny that racism exists, or to deny that it can have a negative impact on upward mobility. It does, and it can. The question is how much impact it has compared to other factors. My point is that racism and discrimination cannot be used as all-purpose explanations for inequality, because we have too many examples of upward mobility and prosperity among groups that face discrimination. I'll give you one more example of discrimination in and of itself being an unsatisfactory explanation for inequality. In the U.S., the poverty rate among blacks is about a third higher than it is among whites. Some people want to attribute that to racism. But among married blacks, the poverty rate is quite low. It's in the single digits and has been for almost 30 years. In fact, in some years, the poverty rate among married blacks has not only been lower than among blacks as a whole, it's been lower than among whites as a whole. So, is the racial gap in poverty a function of racism, or more a function of different attitudes towards marriage among different groups? Is the higher black poverty rate being driven by discrimination, or by the fact that blacks have lower marriage rates than whites, and married people tend to have higher incomes? My larger point is that inequality today between different racial or ethnic groups in the U.S. has less to do with discrimination and far more to do with different cultural attitudes and behaviors and habits. And I'm not just talking about attitudes towards marriage and education. One of the biggest differences is in antisocial behavior or crime rates. A few years ago, I wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal on the prevalence of violent crime in poor black neighborhoods. And in the column, I used a quote from Martin Luther King, who once said to a black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" King said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." After the column ran, a number of readers contacted the paper and accused me of making up the quote, which comes from a 1961 profile of King written by the famous black author James Baldwin in Harper's Magazine. I was a little surprised by this reaction because, of course, all you have to do these days is Google the quote to find the source. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility. Now, King was obviously a uniquely gifted and capable leader, and I'm not suggesting that black people today need another King. They don't. What I'm suggesting is that King represented a type of leadership, a type of thinking, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that politicians and social activists and policymakers today barely even give lip service to. King and his generation of leaders believed that whites obviously had a role to play in changing a fundamentally racist system. But they also understood that blacks had a role to play, and they were willing to hold blacks accountable, despite the white racism, the legal and rampant white racism that existed at the time. They asked something of black people. They operated under the belief and tried to instill in young people the belief that blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers, that blacks can't sit around waiting for whites to get their act together first. You can contrast that with attitudes today among activists and politicians who express concern about the plight of the black underclass. They ask almost nothing of black people themselves. They spend much more time making excuses for the kind of antisocial behavior that prominent black leaders of the King era would regularly condemn. Young black kids today are sent out into the world with a chip on their shoulders. They're told that the cops are gunning for them, that their teachers are racist, that the tests are racist, that the employers are racist, that the judges and the prosecutors The entire justice system is stacked against them. They're told that the world owes them, and that if they don't succeed, it's not really their fault. So, at a time when young blacks today are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial prejudice, at a time when you have a generation of blacks who came of age with a twice-elected black president, we have people in positions of influence and authority insisting that blacks can't be held in any way responsible for these persistent racial gaps until white racism has been essentially vanquished from America. In many cases, you're dealing with black leaders and activists who consider any focus on black responsibility or accountability to be itself a form of racism. And the academic and political and media establishment, for the most part, plays right along. The discussion of race and crime today is a good example of what I'm talking about. In the media, on college campuses, among civil rights activists and political figures, even in the world of sports, a fundamentally dishonest narrative has taken hold. The press, my profession, is very eager to break down police shootings by race, but hesitant to break down criminal behavior by race, which gives the public a very distorted picture of what's happening. Study after study, going back decades, has shown that blacks are arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than whites based on behavior. That doesn't mean there are no racist police or no police who abuse their authority, but it's clear that racism in and of itself is an inadequate explanation for higher rates of arrests and incarceration among blacks. There's no complete national database on police shootings in America. Some police departments report more expensive data than others, and perhaps some uniform system should be put in place. I certainly would have no objection to that. But the data we do have show that in a typical year, police are involved in approximately 2 or 3% of black shooting deaths in this country. In 2019, for example, there were 492 murders in Chicago. Only 3 involved police. Now, as I watched the George Floyd protest the following summer, I kept thinking about that statistic. 492 homicides, and 489 of them had nothing to do with police. If Chicago has a policing problem, it is clearly a secondary problem. Chicago's first-order problem is crime, and those crimes are not being committed by and large by the police. In New York City, where I'm based, we have the nation's largest population and largest police force. And it so happens that the New York City Police Department has kept detailed records of police shootings, going all the way back to 1971, so more than 50 years now. That year, 1971, police shot 314 people, 91 of them fatally. 2 decades later, the number of police shootings in New York had fallen from 314 to 108, and fatalities had fallen from 93 to 27. The most recent numbers I've seen from before the pandemic are from 2019, when New York City police shot 34 people and killed 10. So we're talking about a roughly 90% reduction in police shootings and police shooting fatalities in the nation's largest city with the nation's largest police force over the past 50 years. And New York is no outlier here. Police shootings have fallen dramatically nationwide and in other major cities over the past half century. Meanwhile, we have social activists claiming that police shootings are not only rising, but have reached epidemic proportions. It's another example of how a prevailing narrative can be almost completely divorced from the empirical data. But if we want to begin to do something about social inequalities, we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to correct the false narratives that so often drive the discussion. According to federal figures, police shootings of black people have fallen by more than 70% nationwide since 1970. This idea of trigger-happy cops out there today systematically gunning for young black men, based on everything we know, is a myth. Yet we have entire movements today advancing this narrative, and the media expressing next to no skepticism of this narrative. We've had street protests and rioting all over the country based on this narrative. We have pro-athletes refusing to stand for our national anthem in protest of police targeting young black men. Again, they think there's some epidemic going on out there. It's a narrative that has gained tremendous currency based on anecdotal evidence and social media videos that have gone viral. But no empirical data support this narrative. We've reached a point where the facts don't really matter anymore. All that matters is controlling the narrative. The media would have you believe that the main problem in our inner cities is policing. But the sad reality is blacks are only about 13% of the population in the U.S., yet commit more than half of all murders in the U.S. Roughly 7,000 blacks are murdered each year, and 90% of them are killed by other black people, not by police. Now there is your epidemic. In New York, which is one of the safer big cities in the U.S., blacks are about 26% of the population, but commit 75% of all shootings. Whites are about 34% of the population, but commit less than 2% of the shootings. And this isn't a New York phenomenon. You'll find similar numbers in other large cities: Detroit, Cleveland, Oakland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and so forth. In fact, homicide, murder, is the leading cause of death for young black men in the U.S. And it's not because cops are killing them. If you really believe that black lives matter, and you want to reduce that black body count, just as a practical matter, should your focus be on the 2% of black shooting deaths that involve police, or the 98% that don't? In the U.S., unfortunately, we spend almost all of our time discussing the 2%, because there's a reluctance to have honest conversations about the real problem. People would rather talk about racism or police brutality, but the bigger problem is criminality, antisocial behavior, attitudes towards law enforcement. The bigger problem is cultural. And this gets us to another important question, which is whether the focus of our politicians and policymakers should be on equal outcomes, or whether the focus should be on making sure that people have the freedom and the tools to progress at their own pace. Milton Friedman said that a society that puts equality of outcomes ahead of freedom will end up with neither freedom nor equality. Friedman wasn't any more of a fan of inequality than you or I am. He wanted to see more equal outcomes like everyone else. But he understood that how we pursue that goal matters. And he understood the limits of social policy. What ultimately closes gaps in the development of human capital. What ultimately closes these gaps is the development of human capital. And groups develop that human capital on their own, over time, and at differing speeds. The real danger is in the policy interventions that interfere with a group's self-development. That's what happened in the 1960s, when the U.S. decided to massively expand the size of the welfare state in this country. These were well-meaning, well-intentioned programs, but many of them turned out to be counterproductive because they, in fact, interfered with that internal self-development that has to take place. And trends among blacks illustrate my point. Prior to the 1960s, in the first half of the 20th century, when blacks were far more focused on developing this human capital, we saw racial gaps narrowing in income, narrowing in educational attainment, narrowing in black representation in the middle-class professions and elsewhere. blacks were not only making gains in absolute terms, they were also gaining on whites. But following the welfare state expansions of the 1960s and the black leadership's decision to shift much of their focus to things like attaining political power and racial preferences, that previous progress slowed down or it stalled. In some cases, it even reversed course. Let me offer you a few examples of this. For most of the first half of the 20th century, black marriage rates in the U.S. were equal to or higher than white marriage rates. In the 1940s and 50s, black labor participation rates exceeded those of whites. Black incomes grew at much faster rates than white incomes. And the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. Between 1940 and 1970, so this is during legal segregation in the U.S., and prior to the era of affirmative action, the number of blacks in middle-class professions, accountants, engineers, social workers, lawyers, quadrupled. Between 1960 and 1970, black incomes in the U.S. doubled. They rose for whites during that decade as well, but not as fast as they rose for blacks. In other words, during this period, racial gaps were not just narrowing, but narrowing in some cases quite rapidly. Steady progress was being made. It was being made during a time of rampant racism. It was being made without racial preferences for blacks. And it was being made when blacks had very little political clout in this country, certainly as compared to what they have today. Downplaying group behavioral differences or shielding people from any responsibility for their situation may seem like the charitable thing to do in light of all the atrocities that blacks have endured in the United States. But the relevant question is whether it's helpful. More than anything else, the black underclass needs the human capital, the values, the habits, the attitudes, the behaviors that facilitate economic advancement, regardless of who gets elected. A previous generation of black leaders understood this, and unprecedented black advancement was the result. I'd like to see this history inform our current debates about racial and income inequality. I'll stop there and take any questions if you have them, but thank you.
Jason, thank you very much for the talk. My name is David. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first question is, you've been around, obviously, press and academia for many years, it sounds. And you have also been around Thomas Sowell a lot, and I can only assume you're a conservative who sees a lot of value in institutions and understands that there's often a lot of good things in them which are not easily replicable and we don't always entirely understand. And yet I think it's very obvious and to anybody, but especially from your descriptions, these are two institutions which have been very important, academia and press, but have very much veered off the path of their original goals in informing the public and creating and disseminating knowledge. So I wanted to ask, what is your approach towards press and academia today? Do you hope that these are institutions which can be rescued and salvaged, or would you want to kind of burn the bridge and try to build an alternative with all the risks that entails?
Well, I think it would be tough to start over again. In terms of the press, these are by and large businesses, and to the extent that they're no longer reliable sources of information or objective information or giving their customers what they want, they run the risk of losing business and going out of business. And I think that's something the free market can take care of over time. In academia, you're dealing with a slightly different situation. Nonprofits, some of these schools have these huge endowments, particularly the big elite schools with billion-dollar endowments, and free market pressure, I think, is going to be less effective, at least in the short term, when it comes to dealing with them. I think as a journalist in my writings, what I've stressed, and you mentioned Thomas Sowell, and his work has certainly informed my journalism significantly over the course of my career. But he has written that you have to understand that intellectuals are their own interest group and ought to be understood as such. And you can't conflate the priorities and the agenda of intellectuals and elites with the people they claim to be speaking on behalf of. And that's certainly the case with these activist groups and many members of the media, but certainly with civil rights activist groups and so forth, and black politicians by and large, claiming to speak on behalf of low-income minorities and actually often holding views polar opposite to what those groups want. So you take something like affirmative action, racial preferences. A majority of black people oppose racial preferences in higher education. The elites and the intellectuals support those things. Voter ID laws showing identification in order to cast a vote. Again, a majority of blacks support that. A majority of black elites do not. A majority of blacks support school choice, giving money directly to parents and letting them spend it how they want, rather than forcing them to go to some government-assigned school, is supported by a large majority of blacks. It is opposed by most black elites. Sol, in the course of writing a biography of Sol, I went through a bunch of interviews he had done over the years, particularly on television, and he would often get asked, how does it feel to go against the grain of so many other blacks? And he said, he would always correct the premise of the question. He'd say, you don't mean I go against the grain of most blacks. You mean I go against the grain of most black elites, most black intellectuals. But he would say most black elites and intellectuals don't represent most blacks any more than white elites and white intellectuals represent most whites. And so I try and keep that in mind in terms of my writings, that you can't assume that the spokesmen out there are speaking in the interest of the people they claim to.
I'm Moore. I'm studying in the university here in Israel. It was really interesting listening to you. I wanted to ask you, you talked about a lot of inequality between blacks and whites in the US. Can you refer about it a little bit in relation to the inequality between women and men in the US?
How do you mean? Does, for instance, prejudice or sexism explain differences in outcomes?
Yeah, because you were talking a lot about the statistics that explain a lot of your theory, and maybe you have some references about this related to women and men.
Well, there is an argument in the left that gender gaps are explained by and large by sexism. But it turns out in many cases that when you do a proper apples-to-apples comparison, those gender differences largely disappear. For example, if you look at earnings between men and women, and you control for years, not only years in the workforce, but continuous working in the workforce, not interrupting to say have a child or take time away from the workforce for this or that. When you compare women and men apples to apples in that regard, a lot of these disparities that are attributed to sexism go away. So I do think there are some parallels here in being very quick to assume that where we see differences, something nefarious is necessarily going on. And again, it's not to say that sexism doesn't exist, but the question is it sexism that is explaining these differences in outcomes? And I don't think we should be so quick to draw that conclusion. For the same reasons, I don't think we should be so quick to blame racism or prejudice when it comes to black-white differences.
Hi, my name is Yuval Yamshachal. I study political science and I'm working as a manager of an international educational program. And I agree with your assumption that basically education starts, first of all, in the house that you grew up in. But do you believe that the government has nothing to do with solving the gap that we have between every house? I don't know if I explain myself correctly, but basically there is also social economic differences between, let's say, whites and blacks in the US, right? So the country shouldn't do more, like some sort of policy to help with the education of the,
Sure.
yeah, I mean.
Sure, sure. I can talk about that. No, my argument is not that there's nothing that can be done or that there's nothing that government can do. My problem is that the government interventions, in many cases, have been counterproductive. Efforts to help have not helped. And we ran a very large-scale experiment here in the U.S. back in the 1960s, where the government decided to help out a lot. We spent unprecedented amounts of money on helping, redistributing wealth. We thought the problem with poor people is that they don't have enough money. If the government sent them checks, they'd have money, and everything would be fine. We would tax, wealthier people at extravagant rates. We would transfer that money directly or in kind to less well-off people, and we would solve poverty this way. This was called the War on Poverty. It was called the Great Society. We ran this experiment. It just didn't work. It did not work as intended. And instead of reevaluating the incentives we put in place, by and large, we have tended to simply double down on the same strategy over and over and over again. We were doing it in response to the pandemic, expanding the welfare state as a means of helping people. If large government wealth transfer programs helped solve poverty, we would have solved them in America a long, long time ago. They don't work. What these programs often did was put in place basically subsidies for antisocial behavior. We tried to replace fathers in the home with a government check. We rewarded irresponsible behavior. We told women, if you had more children and the father wasn't around, we'd send you more money. And if we caught the father around, we penalized the mother. So she had an incentive to make sure the father did not spend any time around the kid, lest some social worker catch them in the act. At one point in the 1980s, the welfare benefits were so large that it made perfect sense for someone on welfare not to look for a job. They would never find a job that paid as much as the government was paying them not to work. And so I wrote a book a few years ago called Please Stop Helping Us. And it was an evaluation of these programs. And my point is not, is that the government is doing a lot of things that don't work. And the best thing the government could do is to stop doing those things that don't work. Stop putting in place incentives not to return to the labor force. Stop lifting the wage floor, the minimum wage, which prices less experienced, younger workers out of the labor force, a disproportionate number of whom happen to be black. Stop putting in place occupational licensing requirements that make it very difficult for some budding entrepreneur to go out and start their own business, their own taxi cab company or something along those, or hair braiding operation or what have you. Stop forcing children to attend failing schools. So there are things that the government can do, but I don't want the government to put in place ever larger wealth redistribution schemes, because I've seen the track record of the ones they've tried before. In terms of one of the big things that came out of the Great Society was affirmative action. Racial preferences for blacks, both in the workforce, but also in academia. We've had, almost 50 years of racial preferences for blacks in higher education. I mentioned that most blacks oppose them. So do most whites. And they oppose them for various reasons. But one very good reason to oppose them is that they don't work. Regardless of whether they're constitutional, we're having a big debate over their legality in America right now, and maybe the Supreme Court is going to finally decide whether they are. But we can look at whether or not they actually work as intended. And it turns out that after the University of California system back in the mid-1990s ended racial preferences in higher education, black graduation rates went up. Hispanic graduation rates went up after the school stopped taking race into account. Black graduation rates went up. They also went up in the more difficult disciplines of math and engineering and science and so forth. So a program that had been put in place to increase the number of middle-class blacks in America, to increase the number of black doctors and lawyers and engineers, had in practice resulted in fewer black middle-class people than we would have had in the absence of the policy. So there are things that the government can do, but mostly those things involve getting out of the way and letting these groups develop internally, culturally, the way they have to in order to rise out of poverty and stay out of poverty. And too often, I think, the government interventions interfere with that internal development.
But do you think reforms in education, not higher education, but like education in general, can affect that, giving like freedom of opportunity?
Can they? Yes. And that's why one policy I would support is school choice. And we see, the states, an increasing number of states have moved in this direction. We have a charter school movement in America. Charter schools are public schools, but they're able to operate independently. And most importantly, they don't have to be unionized the way that traditional public schools in America are. And it's really that unionization of traditional public education that stymies a lot of innovation that I'd like to see happen. So I'm very happy to see this charter school movement. They can be more innovative. They seem to do a very good job of helping low-income minorities in particular. So they're opposed by teachers' unions. They're opposed by a lot of Democratic politicians that take money from teachers' unions. So it's a big fight. But yes, I think that reforming K through 12 education, primarily through giving parents more choice in terms of what schools they can attend or their children can attend, I think will do a lot of good. And I think things are moving in that direction.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have one question.
Sure.
So I think I remember that you mentioned, or I saw in maybe in your new book, the back of your new book that wasn't published yet, that you seen that some policies that Trump had were helpful for the black community, and that they were basically stopped or reversed when Biden went in. I hope I'm remembering correctly.
Sure.
So I would just like you to expand on that.
Sure. So I'll back up a little bit. I was explaining what was going on in terms of racial inequality in America in the first half of the 20th century, and well into the middle of the century, in fact. And I mentioned incomes growing, years of education growing among blacks, both in absolute terms and relative to whites, home ownership, labor force participation, all of these things moving in the right direction. Well, one of the reasons that was happening was due to the economic boom that America experienced in the post-World War II years. There have been several studies done that show that blacks made their greatest gains economically since slavery in the years after World War II, the late 1940s, leading all the way up to the early 1970s. And that's remarkable for a number of reasons. One is that most of that time period, America is still racially segregated. You can still put a sign in your window that says, "We don't hire blacks," or "You can't live in this neighborhood. You can't work in this industry. You can't go to this school." And still, we saw these gains. This was a time when blacks had very little political clout in this country. It wasn't until really the 1970s, really the 80s, when you started to see black mayors of large cities, black governors, more black representation in Congress, and so forth. So the period I'm talking about predates all of that, and yet you saw these economic gains, and that had a lot to do, I argue, with labor markets and black access to labor markets. The economy was booming. All groups did well, but blacks did especially well during this time period. During the Trump years, we saw a smaller version of the same thing happening. In other words, we saw faster economic growth than what we had seen under Barack Obama. And the result was a little boomlet for blacks in this country economically. Black wages prior to the pandemic under Trump were growing at a faster rate than white wages were growing. The black poverty rate, again, prior to the pandemic under Trump, fell to record lows for blacks. Black unemployment fell to record lows during the same period. And as I said, black incomes are rising faster than white incomes. It was largely a working class boom that we saw going on. Many people at the bottom or near the bottom were doing better as the economy was growing faster. It just so happens that blacks and to some extent Hispanics are overrepresented in the working class. So the benefits redounded to them especially. But it was really a working class boom. So I wrote this book that the previous questioner mentioned called The Black Boom. It's my most recent book. It came out earlier this year, explaining those economic gains and attributing them to faster economic growth. And I think that Trump's tax cuts, corporate tax cuts and income tax cuts contributed to this because they incentivized companies to bring money back from overseas, reinvest in the United States, and so forth, particularly in the manufacturing field. And I also attribute it to lighter regulation of businesses that we saw under Trump. Again, giving businesses an incentive to grow and to hire. And I argue that essentially what blacks need, if you're interested in less income inequality, are tight labor markets and fast economic growth. And that is far more important than a woke president, having a woke president, or having a president who looks like you, who's black. It's more important than wealth redistribution schemes. It's more important than racial preferences. Tight labor markets are what low-income people need, and access to those markets, and then they can take care of the rest. We saw it in a previous generation of blacks when the economy was growing in the 60s. We saw it when the economy was growing in the 90s. And we saw it again under Trump. The pandemic brought an end to a lot of this. And subsequent to the pandemic, of course, we get the election of Joe Biden. And the problem with what Joe Biden is doing is that he wants to revert to a lot of the economic policies that we saw under President Obama. And my fear, he wants to expand the welfare state. He wants to raise taxes instead of cutting them. He wants to re-regulate the economy. And those are the types of things I think will lead to the type of outcomes we saw under Obama, which was slower economic growth and more income inequality. And so to that extent, I'm fearful that we're moving in the wrong direction.
We have a program through our institute where we teach this idea of economic freedom. And basically, what we're saying, we're sort of like making what might be called an extreme case, which is that government has one role, which is to minimize interference and maximize economic growth. And we find in these various indices with regard to economic freedom, with regard to size of government, the quality of law, the stability of money, etc., that more economic freedom means more growth. So if I state in the extreme case that's the role, that's how we should think of government, okay? to create conditions to maximize growth, and leave it up to individuals to deal with the realities of their own families, their own neighborhoods, their own communities, their own cultures, to figure out how to take advantage of this growth. Yeah. So would you sign off on that view of the world? That this idea, there's an expression that's very popular in Israel called social justice. That there's really just one socially just thing that the government can do, and that's maximize growth and let individuals maximize their own situation to take care of that. Now, let me just ask one part two of that is coincident with your appearance here is a new book by Thomas Piketty, in which he very, very rigorously argues against everything you just said. and there's an awful lot of people that believe it. So number one, you sign off on the view that I just presented. And number two, if it's so clear, why is it so hard to get people to believe it? And why do so many people still buy into this other stuff? Okay.
Well, I do agree with what you said there in terms of the role of government and the benefits of limited government, and it's not an ideological argument. It's based on empirical data. It's based on history. It's based on experience. We've seen it work in the past. I'd also add that if you're someone who's worried about discrimination, holding back groups, free market capitalism is your best friend, because not because it's going to eliminate discrimination. I have a pretty dour view of human nature. I don't think discrimination is going to be eliminated anytime soon. But what free market capitalism does is it puts a price on discriminating, and so if you don't want to rent your apartments to blacks or Asians, fine, but those apartments are going to sit empty, and someone's going to have to pay for them, and you're losing money. And in that sense, again, so capitalism is I think the best way to address free market capitalism is I think the best way to address racial inequality. The Piketty view and the social justice view of the world in general, I think the problem with it is where I started my talk. Social justice defines justice as equal outcomes, and automatically assumes that where we don't have equal outcomes, something is amiss, something nefarious is amiss, and so when you start with that assumption, you're going to see racism everywhere. You're going to see injustice everywhere, because you're assuming that these balanced outcomes, these racially or ethnically or proportionate outcomes are the norm, when in fact they're not. And if you're in a place like America, where you have people from all over the world, from all different cultures, all different geographic locations, coming to America with different attitudes, different habits, different types of human capital, and you put them all together in one country and think you're going to have equal outcomes. My heavens! I mean, it's a ridiculous notion, but it is something that the left clings to. They've clung to it for a long, long time. And I guess it is somewhat counterintuitive that differences in outcomes are natural, and maybe that's why people have a tough time accepting it. But it is the norm down through history. There has been no society where we have these equal outcomes that are held up as the norm in America. Unequal outcomes have been the norm historically.
I mean, look, Piketty is going to sell a lot of books. I don't think there's any question about it. So maybe to reformulate and say this. So as someone who believes in free markets, capitalism, etc., you understand the benefits of competition. That is, if somebody's got a better product, it puts the less attractive product out of the market. But yet we have a product, the stuff you're talking about, where the case for it is absolutely compelling. Why does this product have such a hard time pushing this other product that we think is very, very wrong out of the marketplace? And why does it survive? And why, if we go look at the United States, we have candidates who run on these platforms, and half the people in the country vote for them. What is the problem? Who is doing what wrong?
Well, one problem is the K through 12 education system we were discussing earlier, where I don't think kids are learning these things in school. They're not learning. In America, I mean, most of our grade schoolers can't read or write at grade level. It's funny. You have people out there who want to teach them critical race theory or about social justice and so forth. We're going to have a bunch of illiterate social justice warriors in America because these kids can't read and write at grade level, and the outcomes are even worse when it comes to things like science and history. So part of the problem here is that you're explaining something that I think would resonate with better educated individuals, and our K through 12 system in this country is not doing its job. But it's also, again, I think free market, our side in this case has a tougher sell. Again, because I think a lot of this is counterintuitive. I mean, someone throws out something like, it's on both sides. It doesn't matter who's making some of these arguments, but even when someone like a Republican, like Donald Trump, argues against free trade and says buy American, buy American products, support America. We have 200 years of economic history explaining why protectionism is not good for the individual country. Not good for the citizens of those countries, leads to higher prices and all the rest. Comparative advantage, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, all the rest. But it's still a tough sell. It's a tough sell. It seems counterintuitive. We have people out there saying things like, America's a rich country. Why should we have a border at all? Why can't anyone just come here because they're poor? And we'll take care of them. We're a rich country. We'll send them checks from Washington, and so forth. And you have to explain what kind of incentives you're putting in place when you do that sort of thing. So a lot of this, I think a lot of free market principles are somewhat counterintuitive, and they take some explaining, and sometimes it's more difficult to make that case. Sol. I guess the best way I've had it explained to me is Sol's book, A Conflict of Visions, and what he talks about in that book are these two views of the world and of human nature. He talks about the constrained view and the unconstrained view, and the constrained view, or the tragic view, he sometimes calls it, is this view that there are limits to human betterment. There are limits to what we can do. You may want to end war, you may want to end poverty, you may want to end discrimination, but that's not likely to happen. So the best thing we can do is to put in place institutions and processes that help us best deal with problems we're never going to solve entirely. And there's your constrained view, which of course Sol adopts. I adopt it to some extent too. And thinkers down through history, that's Edmund Burke adopted this, and so Immanuel Kant and others adopted this more constrained view. And on the other side, you have this unconstrained view, and that's where your social justice types are like. And their view is that not only can we manage inequality or racism, we can solve it entirely. It's just a matter of willpower and reason. And not only that, there are no trade-offs involved. Everyone can have everything, and it's a more utopian view of human nature and what can be accomplished. And it's really hard to argue against the utopian view if you're on the other side. That's a tough case to make, and I think that's part of the challenge you're describing.
Okay, so look, I think we have to wrap up. So it's such a pleasure to have you, Jason. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And I can just tell you personally, and I hope my colleagues sitting there listening that I wasn't able to join tonight echo my sentiments here. That you're really doing extremely important work, and I'm sure there's many moments when it's very discouraging, but please keep on and please keep fighting for this because it's very critical. So thank you so much. And,
Thank you.
And maybe one of these days we'll get you to physically come and speak in Israel.
I'd like that. Thank you.